Today's Can Talks will discuss the situation with coronavirus in Sweden. When the virus hit Sweden, the country has responded in quite an unorthodox way, very different from its Nordic neighbors, but also very different from the rest of the world. We will speak about this with two Swedish journalists, Alice and Karin. Hi Alice, hi Karin. Can you please introduce yourselves?
Yes, my name is Karin Wasteson, and I'm a financial journalist. I've been based in London since 2006, and I'm currently editor of Private Equity Wire, and I've just currently relocated to Jen. Yeah.
Well, my name is Alice. I've been in London for almost 6 years now. I'm also from Stockholm, and I'm also a financial journalist, but I focus more on personal finance. So I work for The Sun at the moment. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you. Okay, so shall we just start with questions? So can you explain what's the general sentiment of the public in Sweden regarding how the government was handling coronavirus at the moment, and also if it changed since the beginning of the lockdown and now? I don't know, Alice, you can start.
Yeah, well, so I went to Sweden just as the UK went into lockdown, so like 3 months ago, like the end of March, and I came back the end of May. So I was in Sweden for 2 months during, well, when all other countries went into lockdown, and I can only speak for myself and my friends and my family, but people thought that the government was doing a good job, or people do trust the government, so I think people thought that they were doing what's best for their citizens. Obviously that might have changed now because we have quite a high death rate, but so I know a lot of people might have wanted the government to be stricter, but I mean, I can't speak for the whole population because I haven't seen any studies, so I don't know what everyone thinks. But yeah, I could only speak for the people I know.
And what do you say, Karin?
Yeah, I would say because I've been based in the UK throughout during the first 3 months of lockdown in the UK, and there are a few things that I would mention just from the experience of being in London, but then also speaking to people at home. So I think I won't talk about so much the outcome or death rate so much, because that's, ultimately there is a lot of uncertainty, and many people are saying that it will be a while until we ultimately see what has been the best policy or the best outcome in the end, because they're also talking about a second wave, for example, that might occur in the UK and in many European economies that are opening up at the moment, and that we're already seeing in an increase in cases, or cases starting to pick up again. But there were a few things that sort of just concerned me a bit with the disparities between the countries, just in terms of attitude and how the crisis was viewed initially and how things evolved. So I would say, for me, there are 4 or 5 main factors that I viewed as a bit of an issue. And so I would say the first one is there seemed to be limited or selective information in Sweden. So whereas in the UK, there's been a very clear focus on constantly reviewing the international response. So what are other countries doing? What works well? What did South Korea do? What did Taiwan do that worked well? What hasn't really worked? Who are the countries that are approaching this in a sensible manner, as well as internally, constantly reviewing the internal response and constantly reviewing that information. And there seemed to be more of a debate and discussion within the country and between scientists and government within the UK. And I think there was also a bit, there seemed to be a sort of, in Sweden, a bit of a lack of, at least when I spoke to people who were in Sweden at the time, there seemed to be a slight sort of issue of access to global news and awareness of the situation outside of the country. Because like you mentioned, Alice, many people were just sort of saying, oh no, this seems like a good thing we're doing, we're just going to back up the government, you know, whatever they say, we're going to go with it, we're going to trust that. And I understand that the need maybe to do that in a crisis. But I would say that there were things that were coming out in UK media, so facts about how the virus spread, who are the risk groups, just facts around face covering or the climate impact on the virus. And there seemed to be, whenever I spoke to people in Sweden, there seemed to be a few weeks lag of information between the media coverage in the UK. So what was already sort of known in the UK only picked up, you know, later on in Sweden. But that's also because of the spread of the virus was, so the UK was a few weeks ahead. So that's also natural because of that. So I would say one of the main points then would be that whereas in the UK, there's been this constant internal review and debate and criticism of the government's own handling of the crisis, which I think is extremely useful and vital for improving. Whereas in Sweden, there's been more one voice, one expert. You know, Tegnell has received almost all of the coverage, and whatever he said was, you know, the law basically. Yeah, and I think there are many factors that prop up this disparity, but I think we can maybe go back to that later or cover that in a separate question.
I think it's very interesting that you both mentioned mistrust in the government in Sweden, when it was obviously doing something very different than the rest of the world. And I think in most of the other countries, people would question the government. So what would you say is the reason that Swedish people were trusting the government to such a high level, as it wasn't the case in the UK? I mean, even in like Croatia, for example, if I look at it, we were like doing the same sort of approach as most of the countries who did kind of like, let's say, well. But people were still kind of questioning and criticizing when they could. So what would you say is the reason why Swedish people had such a like high trust into the government throughout this whole time? I mean, anyone can start.
Well, I like to think that Swedes are known for like following the rules and just, yeah, we like to stick to the rules. And I think like with this whole thing with the trust in government, it's just always been the case. Like when I first came back to Sweden, my family talking about the whole situation, it was just like we didn't need the strict lockdown measures because people take recommendations as more than just recommendations. They take them, like a lot of my friends, we weren't forced to stay in, but a lot of my friends did anyway because that's what they thought was the right thing to do. And I think, yeah, people just trust, we kind of trust the authorities more than other countries. I'm not sure why, but it's just always been the case with Swedes.
Would you agree with that, Karin? What would you say to that?
I mean, again, because I wasn't here during the during the pandemic or the first 3 months of the pandemic, so I wasn't I didn't see how people actually behaved here. But I would just say one thing, and I mean, there was one attitude though that I noticed in Sweden where people said, you can't just lock everything down, and people need to be able to, move freely. And I would say that, I mean, that it is possible. We did that in the UK, and it is to protect other people. So it was just that I've noticed as well was a sort of difference just in kind of attitude or way of thinking. But then there's also a question, a little bit of fairness. So, I mean, obviously, most people will do what the government says, of course. And I do agree that, you know, Sweden in general is quite a law-abiding society. But I think when you sort of let people, there's a slight issue of unfairness as well, I would say, because if then some people follow the restrictions or recommendations very strictly and then other people don't, and then you continue to see a spread, then I can understand how people would see that as, I mean, the fact is though that it hasn't really worked. So, you know, there have been images of many people in Stockholm, for example, being out in the nightlife, even at the height of the spread of the infections. And to be honest, I saw that in the UK as well. And to us, then that is sort of a bit frustrating if there are, you know, the majority are following the rules and then some people aren't. And I can see the need for wanting to implement stricter measures and the government saying, well, actually, this isn't optional. We need to do this now as a nation, and we need to come together. So I would slightly actually oppose the fact as well that to say that Sweden would follow these measures, whereas other countries wouldn't. I mean, Asian countries are very, very good at. They all kind of supported their own government strategies. In the UK, they did as well. So I'm not sure that is. I wouldn't say it's unique to Sweden, but I would say there are a few other factors that I've thought about that would contribute to that.
I think it's quite interesting also when you compare Sweden to like Norway and Denmark, for example, which are always, like Nordic countries are always kind of in comparison with each other, and they are considered to be very similar. But then Denmark and Norway had like completely different approach. So what would you say is like the reason for that? Is there some cultural reason that we are not aware of, or some like social or historical reason why Sweden was like so different than its neighbors? Alice?
I mean, I'm not entirely sure why Denmark and Norway took such a different approach, but I actually looked into it, and like our constitution doesn't allow for full-on lockdown. It has to go through parliament. Like they can close businesses, or they can close shops, so you can't go to the hairdresser, for example, but they can't tell the whole population to just stay at home and not go out anytime during the day, like they've done in Italy and Spain, without having to go through parliament. And that's, because apparently we can't have a state of emergency in peacetime according to our constitution. So that is obviously a historical thing. And I think in other countries that have allowed for these to speed process up with certain rules and laws, but just that would be too big of a change for them to put through just overnight. Like it would have, like all the people in politics would have to agree. But I'm not sure why we've done it so differently from Denmark and Norway, because we are pretty similar. I think Sweden obviously has a larger population, but then I'm not sure. What do you think, Karin? Do you have any ideas?
Well, yes, so I listened into a really interesting program on Jacobin Radio, and it was an American professor who he was interviewed on American radio, and he was talking about the Sweden's pandemic response in relation to history, and he was saying that, for example, during the Second World War, when Norway was occupied, and many of the other Nordic countries were involved somehow in the Second World War during that time, but then Sweden actually wasn't. So Sweden stayed neutral, I mean, officially, and it more or less continued as normal during the war, and as much as possible, of course, tried to keep the economy going, but actually even kept going, sort of kept going out, kept keeping life as normal. And there are understandable reasons for why someone would want to do that, but I think he was saying that so he drew parallels to that period of time, and that there are already ways in which Sweden has done that before, and there might be this sort of national response to crisis that no, we won't, we don't want to take any sort of, we want to maintain a rational approach. We don't in any way want to appear kind of irrational or taking an over-drastical approach, maybe. That's at least some of the things that I heard as well coming out of Sweden when I was in the UK. But it is true, there were many drastic measures in many of the European countries, but that was also because the spread was much higher initially in those countries. But I would say that there's also, I have to say, a slight, maybe a bit of nationalism in this as well. So a sort of feeling that, we stay calm during crisis, we remain rational, kind of our way is, the best way, we're going to go our own way, we're not really interested in what others are doing. And I even heard two of the Swedish experts saying on televised interviews during this time that the rest of the world is wrong, basically, and we are right. So there's a slight bit of, I have to say, just a little bit of arrogance right there, I think. And also, there's been, at least it seems like neoliberalism has had a big part in this as well, because there's this sense that we can't interfere with the economy takes precedence over anything else, and it's that notion that the economy is a separate entity and controls us, that it needs to remain open and going at any cost, rather than us controlling it, rather than us being the economy, and that people have the same interests as the economy ultimately. So I think in Sweden there's been that sense of maybe there's either health or economy, health versus economy, and that's an ideology, I have to say. Also, there's quite a bit of individualism, and again, so Sweden isn't used to, Sweden has been in peacetime for over 200 years. It's not, like you said, Alice, used to going into a state of emergency on a national level. Maybe there's a lot of bureaucracy, so you can't take decisions that quickly. And I heard as well many voices saying, we can't just lock down, we can't just do that. And partly because of for governmental reasons, but also I think just in the mind of people and in people's attitudes. So in the UK, for example, it's viewed as something that you do, for others, to protect others, to limit the risk and spread to people that I know over here who said, oh, but everyone is responsible for their own risk, and it's up to them. Basically, it's up to everyone. But this is a crisis that requires a coordinated response, or a national response. So I think that those are just some of the factors that might have contributed to what happened, and to why even Sweden's response was different from its Nordic neighbors, because Sweden has a slightly different history as well.
So can you explain what are the consequences for Sweden now? What was the economic impact? Was it less severe than it would be with the lockdown?
I saw an article by Aftonbladet recently where they said that the Swedish economy has been affected almost to the same degree as countries who did go into lockdown, and that's due to a large part that, as Alice mentioned earlier, that it's a an economy heavily, reliant on exports. So if other economies are suffering, then the Swedish one will as well. But then I think actually one other element will be that because Sweden didn't shut down, because the death rate has been increasing a lot faster than in other countries, then once the rest of Europe starts opening up, then people might be reluctant to go to Sweden. So it might have a negative effect in that sense on the economy. And so, for example, now Swedish citizens are they've been banned from going into Norway and Denmark. I think Denmark today, they eased some of those restrictions, but that just shows as well that it hasn't been a popular approach with regards to their neighbors, with regards to Sweden's neighbors. And there are going to be consequences, I think, of that approach. Yeah.
Also, Swedish state epidemiologist, he said in a recent interview that he thinks that now Sweden would have reacted differently if what we know now about the virus was known 2-3 months ago. So did this change the atmosphere in Sweden, the general population's view, the kind of like general view? What would you say, Alice?
I would hope that every single country, knowing what they do know now, that they would change the processes and policies in terms of coronavirus, because we didn't know, like when it started spreading in January and February, like we didn't know what to expect, and like scientists have had to make stuff up as they go along. And I think like among my friends and family, some probably would have wanted at least stricter, but not a full lockdown, but I think they could have possibly made it a bit stricter than they have. But others, like I have family members who are doctors, and they've seen it firsthand, and they say that like our healthcare system was never really like stretched too thin, like because we had time to prepare. So most people who needed intensive care, they got it. But then, yeah, I think a lot of people are just mortified by the death rate, but which is obviously a lot higher than a lot of other countries that did go into lockdown. I think that's why people would have wanted stricter measures. But then, as we spoke about earlier, we don't know if there's a second wave, and those countries that have been like, and citizens have been like locked inside for 3 months, and if that starts spreading, so they like overtake Sweden in terms of the death rate, then maybe what we did was the good thing. As good as it can be. But I guess, yeah, I don't know exactly what people in Sweden are feeling. I just know that for my friends and family, people are mortified about the death rate, but they probably wouldn't have wanted the government to do anything too different anyway. Does that make sense?
I would just say, I think I just think objectively at this stage, and like Tegnell alluded to as well, I think it's very difficult to call the Swedish strategy successful. I think the main area where it failed was within care homes. And I do think that if some of those risks that was sort of almost written off a little bit in Sweden had instead been evaluated properly. And for example, following more of the World Health Organization's guidelines, so where they were saying early on that testing was very important, test, trace, isolate. That's a strategy that proved to work well in the countries that did implement it, in many Asian countries, for example. So I think in Sweden, so if testing had been taken more seriously, they could have tested care workers, going into people's homes and limit the spread. Also, even countries like Ghana, for example, tested all arrivals that came into the country, all international arrivals, and I am just thinking that if other countries could get policies like that up and running quickly, then why couldn't Sweden do that? One of the richest countries in the world. And I just need to say, I think there has been the Swedish healthcare system has been a little bit overwhelmed as well. And I heard some experts saying that even just 1 month of lockdown would have given the Swedish system more time just to prepare. In the UK as well, the main criticism is that they went into lockdown too late. So I think there are many things that could be learned from this. And then one of the things that relate to this, and I saw a very interesting recent interview with Yuval Noah Hariri. He's the historian who wrote *Sapiens: A Brief History of Mankind*, and he's saying that, and this very much relates to the entire argument I'm trying to make here, that information and the free flow of information is so vital for the national response to the pandemic, both in terms of how the virus spreads and in terms of how to handle lockdown measures. And there needs to be a cooperation in sharing information, and also an openness to receiving information from other parties. And it demands international cooperation. So I think rather than comparing, or then in Sweden's case trying to say, no, we can handle this better, then perhaps maybe a more humble approach and more openness to see, okay, what is working actually, what is working in other countries. But like Tegnell said now, today, maybe he would have taken a different approach. So that's, and just as a journalist, I think that's also that was my main concern, just when I was in the UK, seeing the information that was flowing around within the UK and internationally that we had. And then I listened to Swedish media that just didn't seem to have maybe picked up on that yet, or were, like I said, a few weeks behind. And then I felt I was just concerned about that, the lack of information, or and even knowledge of how the policy was perceived by other countries. Those are the main issues, I think.
And also, Sweden started in the beginning with herd immunity theory, and now it's also proven that herd immunity is not something that can be with this virus. The same. So is that also kind of like one of the things that change in the perspective now when you look at the beginning and now what we know about herd immunity? I mean, Alice, you can start.
I think, well, I'm not an expert in this field, but I think obviously like herd immunity was it's quite controversial. Like in Sweden, I think the priority has been to protect the vulnerable and the elderly, whereas other countries would have wanted the whole population just, I don't know, in lockdown basically. And I think obviously like we haven't reached herd immunity, and we haven't been able to protect because a lot of our deaths are in care homes. So like we've failed in that part. That's just for sure. And I think time will tell if we've reached some kind of immunity in the population that is good to have. I guess we won't know that yet. It's just, when other countries start opening up, then that's when we'll know. But there are definitely lessons to be learned. And I'm sure if this herd immunity is a good thing, because I mean, it's not what you might want to aim for, because a lot of people might die in the process. Because I don't know.
Well, I would say that this herd immunity notion, that would have worked if the virus is actually like the flu. And there was even there was an interview with Tegnell, where he said that the British are, he stated himself that the British are the best in the world when it comes to fighting infections. And in March, Imperial College came out with a report saying that this in this case, the herd immunity strategy will not work, and epidemic suppression is the only viable strategy. Also, The Guardian came out with an article then when it was just around the time when the UK was still, I think, following that theory of herd immunity, and they were saying that herd immunity is basically a disastrous approach. And I think still, because again, so Sweden has been acting on that notion that it would reach a peak without suppression, and then that hasn't happened. So they aren't reaching the peak, and deaths are rising, and that's probably because it is based on a notion that isn't aligned with reality. So that's that's quite worrying if they're operating on a factual basis, which is actually not correct. So I would say that's been a major issue, I would say.
And since you're like kind of running out of time, so let's kind of wrap things up and end up on like a positive note. And just like your comments on like what are like the solutions to this situation, like what can Sweden learn for the future from this, like how to gain trust of the people who are now like opposed the government's measures so far. Like Alice, you can start.
I think they, like any other country, definitely needs to review how they've done things and where they failed and what they did right. And I know Stefan Löfven, our Prime Minister, has commissioned that review because we need to know, like we went against everybody else, so we need to know. And I think the population needs to know if the government didn't do, like if it turns out that what their response was wrong, then they need to own up to that and admit it and apologize, and then need to make that a lot of things we could be better prepared for next time, because there might be a next time, like we don't know, in terms of PPE and care homes and how to protect our elderly and vulnerable. And I think just learning from your mistakes is always a good way to kind of, I don't know, hold your hands up if you messed up. That's just simple way to learn, basically.
What in terms of what to learn from it?
I mean, in terms of solutions for like the Swedish situation now, when obviously the death rate is one of the highest in the world, like what can the government do to kind of gain the trust of the people who are now opposed to how it was handled so far, and like what lessons for the future in the, maybe there will be like next epidemic.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there are two things that I think would be useful. One is introducing testing on a larger scale, but I think they are picking up on that now in Sweden. They have changed their approach and attitude towards that, and in the UK as well, they're trying to really get that up and running because they're realizing the importance of it, as well as antibodies, to see how many in the population that have had the virus. And then a second major thing, which would be important going forward, is maybe rather than having just this one person, one expert, one voice within the country that Tegnell has been, is to maybe have more of a committee of scientists deciding, or letting more voices in rather than a monopoly of information and policy.
Thank you both. This was insightful and interesting.
Thank you very much.